I was assigned to a mission in Ukraine, though I never saw the full dossier. It was classified even by Mossad standards, an operation buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. The coordinates we received led us to a dilapidated facility, deep in a forgotten forest. The land, overgrown and silent, held secrets older than any intelligence report. My team and I had our orders, but we all knew this was not a routine assignment. The equipment was standard, the briefing mechanical, but the air felt different, thick with something we could not yet name. As we arrived, the landscape was silent. No birds, no wind, just a quiet that gnawed at you. The building in question was more ruin than structure, decayed, abandoned, and yet still somehow alive. Each step felt heavy as we trudged through the brush, our boots sinking into the thick mud. My senses were alert, but I dismissed the creeping unease building inside me. It was just a building, or so I told myself. The hum of the team's comms was the only sound. New here? Welcome to Intel Uncovered, where chilling military horror stories come alive. Hit subscribe and step into the shadows with us. An incessant whisper in the air. My eyes kept darting to the shadows at the edge of the trees, to the feeling that something was watching us. But that was just paranoia. Or so I believed at the time. The mission was classified as reconnaissance, the purpose unknown beyond its immediate context. As we neared the facility, the silence deepened. The hum of machinery we had expected to hear did not exist. And yet, something pulsed within the building, a vibration that rattled my bones. The mission was cloaked in secrecy, even by Mossad standards. Our orders were vague. Gather intelligence, establish an understanding of what lay inside. A strategic outpost, they said, a relic of the Cold War, long since abandoned. Satellite imagery had shown strange readings, geometric shapes faintly visible beneath the structure's decaying frame. Some kind of technology, older than anything we had encountered. My commanding officer was careful with his words, and every sentence seemed to contain more hidden meaning than necessary. We were told nothing beyond the bare essentials. 2 weeks of supplies, a full set of reconnaissance gear, and authorization to engage if necessary. In the back of my mind, I wondered how deep this went. No one ever spoke of why it mattered, only that it did. And that was all we needed to know. The team had been carefully selected, each of us with a particular skill set suited to this mission. We knew the risks. The geopolitical implications if something went wrong could be catastrophic. But that did not concern us in the moment. Our focus was on the mission and the operation at hand. The tension was palpable not just in the air, but in every movement of our bodies. The mission was routine, we told ourselves, even as we descended into the unknown. The stakes were clear: gather whatever we could and report back. But it was not long before something began to feel wrong. I could not put my finger on it, but the environment itself seemed to reject us, as though it wanted to remain untouched. There were 5 of us, each one with a role to play, each one with a different history. The team leader, Colonel Moshe Kaplan, was a seasoned officer. His face was stern, unreadable, his eyes cold from years of service. He had been through situations that most would never survive, and his calm demeanor was what kept us all in line. There was no room for fear with Kaplan, only the mission. David, the communications specialist, had the uncanny ability to keep his mind clear in the most chaotic of environments. He was tall, wiry, with a permanent look of concentration. I remember his voice, calm and steady, always relaying signals with precision. Then there was Aaron, the medic. He was quiet, always watching, his expression unreadable as though he carried a burden no one knew about. Ori, the demolitions expert, had a different air about him, reckless and charming, with a tendency to make light of even the most dangerous situations. But underneath the bravado was a razor-sharp focus that allowed him to handle explosives with a meticulousness few could match. Finally, there was Ilya, the tactical expert. His eyes were always scanning the environment, his posture defensive, but fluid. He had a sixth sense for danger, something that went beyond training. We were a tight-knit group, bonded by our shared experiences, but something about this mission felt different from the start. We joked about the odd location, about the forgotten facility. But the jokes felt hollow, even before we set foot inside. We gathered in a small, dimly lit room inside the transport vehicle before we departed. The briefing was sparse, as expected, with Kaplan delivering the details in his usual monotone. We are to assess the facility's contents, evaluate any technological anomalies, and report back with your findings. No engagement unless absolutely necessary. The words were straightforward enough, but there was an edge to Kaplan's voice, a tension I had not heard before. The air felt thick with something unspoken. I remember the moment clearly. The click of the map on the table, the muted hum of the comms gear, the distant sound of the vehicle's engine. We were transported by helicopter, the journey marked only by the low whine of the rotors cutting through the thickening air. The flight was uneventful, though the closer we got, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. By the time we arrived near the drop zone, the usual feeling of anticipation was replaced by a quiet sense of dread. The trees appeared denser, darker. Shadows seemed to reach out to us, clinging to the edges of the clearing. As we disembarked, I felt the weight of something unseen pressing against us, but we did not speak of it. We were trained to ignore such things. Our equipment checked out fine. Radios, thermal goggles, GPS, everything was operational. But something was already wrong. It was in the air, thick and heavy, a taste of iron on the back of my tongue. I glanced at the team. No one spoke, but their eyes betrayed a shared unease. The mission was supposed to be straightforward, but it did not feel that way. The closer we got to the facility, the more that feeling gnawed at me. Something here was not of this world. And as the trees closed behind us, the sense of being followed became undeniable. Something was watching us, not from the trees, not from the facility, from the very air itself. The terrain was difficult to navigate, with dense underbrush clinging to our legs and the oppressive silence making every footstep feel like an intrusion into something ancient. The forest stretched endlessly, as if it had no end. We moved in tight formation, our heavy boots crunching through the wet leaves, the hum of our equipment the only sound punctuating the eerie stillness around us. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly, and I could see my breath in the air, although the sky above us remained cloudless, and there was no breeze. Even our shadows seemed strangely muted, stretched unnaturally long and thin against the dark earth. I glanced back, and for a brief second, the shadows appeared to flicker and shift. I quickly turned forward again, dismissing it as a trick of the light. But the sense that something was wrong lingered, creeping along the edge of my thoughts. The closer we came to the facility, the more unnatural the surroundings became. The trees grew taller and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching towards each other, like skeletal hands grasping for something unknown. The air felt thicker, almost tangible, as if it was closing in on us. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, pressing down with every breath I took. It was as though the very land itself was alive, aware of our presence. I caught David looking nervously over his shoulder, his eyes darting back to the darkening path we had left behind. He was the first to break the silence, speaking in a hushed tone. "Does anyone else feel it? Like we're not supposed to be here?" His words were barely above a whisper, but they echoed in the stillness. Kaplan, as usual, dismissed the unease with a sharp, "Focus, stay sharp." But there was an edge to his voice too, a tension I had never heard before. Even he could not shake the discomfort that clung to us. I could see it in his eyes, flicking quickly to the trees around us, scanning the shadows. He held his hand up, signaling the team to stop. We all froze, listening. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves, the faintest murmur of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. For a moment I thought I heard something else. A whisper, too faint to make out, but unmistakably a voice. It was soft, like a hiss in the wind, and it seemed to come from the direction of the facility. My hand instinctively reached for my weapon, but before I could signal the others, Kaplan motioned for us to continue. As we pushed forward, the trees began to thin, and we emerged into a clearing. The facility loomed before us, a hulking, decayed mass of concrete and steel. It was surrounded by a high fence, its edges rusted and corroded by years of neglect. The gates were open, as though inviting us inside. The building itself seemed to grow out of the earth, as though it had been there long before the forest around it had. The windows were dark, but I swore I could see shapes moving behind them. Faint, indistinct forms that did not belong to the shadows. My heart rate quickened as I scanned the perimeter, but there was no immediate sign of danger. We had made it to our destination, but it did not feel like a victory. "Stay focused. We are here to do a job." Kaplan's voice was a low growl, but it had lost some of its earlier conviction. As we crossed the threshold of the facility, the air felt different, cooler, almost sterile, and yet somehow more suffocating. It was as if we had entered a place that time had forgotten. The walls were covered in a thin layer of dust, but the strange thing was how untouched everything seemed. There were no signs of decay inside, no animals, no insects. The stillness was absolute. The silence deepened. The only sound was the hum of our equipment and the faint echoes of our footsteps as we moved further into the depths of the building. Ilya, as usual, was the first to take the lead, his eyes darting across the corridor. He moved with the quiet precision of someone who had seen the worst the world could offer. "We need to move fast," he muttered. "Check every room, every corner. Stay in formation." His voice was steady, but I could sense the unease in it too. We moved deeper into the facility, our footsteps muffled by the thick, damp air. The building seemed endless, the hallways twisting and turning like a labyrinth. Each room we entered appeared identical to the last. Gray walls, cracked floors, empty spaces. And yet, something about each room felt wrong. The layout didn't make sense. We would find ourselves back in the same place without meaning to, retracing our steps in confusion. Even the light seemed off. Fluorescent lamps flickered above us, casting long shadows that stretched far too far, as though the light itself was unsure of its purpose. Suddenly, we heard it. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. The distant, rhythmic thumping of something heavy hitting the floor. My hand immediately went to my radio, ready to report, but Kaplan held up his hand and gave a small shake of his head. "Keep moving." He said it with such authority that I almost believed him, but I could not shake the feeling that something was watching us, that we were not alone. As we pressed on, the air grew colder, and I felt the pressure in my chest begin to intensify. My breaths were shallow and my heart pounded in my ears. The temperature dropped so rapidly that my breath fogged in the air, despite the absence of any discernible source of cold. We had entered deeper into the bowels of the facility, where the walls began to curve and the layout grew increasingly chaotic. Rooms opened into hallways that twisted at impossible angles. The further we went, the less the place made sense. The building itself seemed to be alive, breathing, changing, shifting. Every time I turned my head, I felt the sense that something was there, something following us, something just beyond the corner of my vision. Ilya turned to me with a sharp look in his eyes. "What the hell is happening here?" he whispered. But before I could answer, the thumping sound came again, louder this time. It was closer. And then, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. We continued forward despite the unease gnawing at us. The deeper we went, the more the facility seemed to distort, as though the walls were closing in on us. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that writhed and shifted in the corners of the rooms. I remember the air growing thicker as we descended into what seemed to be an underground level. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged with each exhale, and I could feel a strange tingling sensation on the back of my neck, as if something invisible was brushing against my skin. Ilya led us, his tactical instincts pushing him to explore every room with a careful eye. The rest of us followed in tense silence, our boots echoing in the hollow expanse. As we passed through one corridor, something caught my eye, a symbol etched into the wall. It was faint, almost hidden, but unmistakable. I paused for a moment, my hand instinctively reaching for the wall. The symbol was circular, its lines winding in an intricate pattern that I did not recognize. It seemed to pulse faintly, as though it was alive, or somehow charged with an energy I could not comprehend. Before I could speak, Kaplan was at my side, his voice low but firm. "Keep moving. We'll look at this later." But I could see the unease in his eyes too. It wasn't just the mission. There was something about this place, something that made him uneasy. We had all felt it by now, but we had no choice but to press on. We had a job to do, and there was no room for hesitation. The deeper we went, the more the environment twisted. The architecture no longer made sense. Hallways turned in impossible directions, stairwells led to dead ends, and doors opened into empty rooms that felt wrong, as though they should have been occupied. The silence was unbearable, suffocating. Even our comms began to distort, the voices of the team warbling and breaking into static. I could hear David muttering something about the readings on his equipment, but his words were unintelligible. Whatever was affecting the facility was now interfering with our instruments. My own GPS was glitching, showing us at coordinates we had not passed, leading us in circles. We were lost, and the sense of disorientation only grew with every step. We came to another door, an old steel door that seemed to be the only way forward. Kaplan motioned for us to stay back while he approached cautiously. There was something about it that made my stomach turn, something off. The door was ajar, but the air that slipped through the crack felt heavy, stale, like it had been sealed for years. As Kaplan slowly pushed the door open, a low hum emanated from the room beyond, a sound that vibrated in my chest and sent a shiver through my spine. We entered the room one by one, the tension thickening with each step. The walls were lined with rows of old equipment, strange machines that hummed with an unnatural energy. The machinery was outdated, its purpose unclear, but something about it seemed wrong. There were wires trailing along the floor, and strange glowing symbols were etched into the walls. The symbols pulsed in time with the hum, faintly glowing and then fading, like a heartbeat. It was impossible to ignore. The hum reverberated in the pit of my stomach, a constant pressure that made it hard to think. As we moved deeper into the room, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room, there was a large, circular platform, surrounded by intricate markings. At first glance, it appeared to be just another part of the machinery, but as I drew closer, I realized that it was far more than that. The platform was covered in a fine layer of dust, but there were faint traces of something else, something dark, almost liquid, smeared across its surface. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the platform. The moment my skin made contact with the surface, a sharp pain shot through my hand, and I pulled it back instinctively. My vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, I saw something standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, its body obscured by shadows, but its eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They were large, unnaturally wide, and they gleamed in the darkness like a predator watching its prey. I blinked, and the figure was gone. A chill ran down my spine, and I stepped back, my hand instinctively reaching for my weapon. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. But the room was silent, and my team looked at me with confusion, their expressions blank. David was the first to speak. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice strained. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. "Nothing. I thought I saw something." "Let's keep moving," Kaplan ordered, his voice clipped, but even he could not mask the edge of tension in his voice. We continued through the room, but the strange figure lingered in the back of my mind. I had seen it, and yet, when I looked again, it was gone. I knew it hadn't been a trick of the light. I had felt it, its presence lingering in the air like a cloud of static. The deeper we ventured into the facility, the more distorted our surroundings became. The walls seemed to shift, and the floor beneath our feet felt unstable, as though it might collapse at any moment. The air was thick with a strange energy, like static electricity clinging to our skin. I could hear whispers now, low and unintelligible, coming from all around us. They seemed to echo through the walls, surrounding us with an oppressive weight. The whispers grew louder, and soon they were no longer whispers at all. They were voices, distorted alien voices speaking in languages I could not understand. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it was impossible. The air itself felt alive, pressing in on us from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. There was something here, something that had been waiting for us, and I knew we had trespassed too far. The facility seemed to stretch further than the blueprint suggested. The more we explored, the more the structure seemed to break the laws of space, like something twisted between dimensions. The walls, once solid, now buckled and rippled like water, as if reality itself was being distorted. The whispers that had haunted us now became louder, clearer, voices calling names, chanting in languages I could not place. I could feel my mind starting to fray at the edges, the persistent hum of the machinery like an incessant buzz that wouldn't stop. It drilled into my skull, my head growing heavier with each passing second. I glanced over at David, who was monitoring his equipment with an intensity I had never seen in him before. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Something's wrong with the comms," he muttered under his breath, though his eyes never left the screen. "The signal's too strong. It's coming from the walls." I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What do you mean, coming from the walls?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tapped furiously at the controls, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the frequency. But the signal was only growing louder, the static crashing against our eardrums. I could hear strange, distorted words, echoes of the same voices that had been whispering in the background. A sudden violent flicker from the light sent a shock through the team. For a moment, the room was plunged into darkness, and we froze, every sense on high alert. The only sound was the humming, growing louder, the air thick with the electric tension of something immense about to occur. Then, the lights returned, but the atmosphere had shifted. The shadows had deepened, and I felt an overwhelming pressure in my chest, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Kaplan signaled for us to move forward, but I noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the slight tremble in his hands as he adjusted his rifle. "Keep it together," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Whatever this place was, it was beginning to strip away the veneer of professionalism. We were no longer a team of highly trained operatives. We were simply people trapped in a nightmare, and the weight of that truth was suffocating. The further we went, the more we encountered anomalies. Doors would lead us into rooms that looked the same as those we had already passed, yet small details were always different. Flickering lights, a chair in a different position, or the faint smell of something rotten in the air. Time itself began to stretch and bend. What felt like hours of exploration passed in what seemed like minutes, and yet we had barely made any progress. Ilya led the way through the maze, trying to maintain a sense of order, but the corridors seemed to fold upon themselves. "This place is like a goddamn funhouse," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. He shot a look at Kaplan, but our leader was too focused on the strange readings his device was picking up. Whatever we were dealing with, it was affecting everything. Our minds, our equipment, even the very air we breathed. We continued deeper into the facility, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain the strange phenomenon. Every room we entered felt colder, the shadows longer, more oppressive. The hum of the machinery never ceased, but it was no longer comforting. It felt like a heartbeat, an ancient pulse that resonated through the bones of the building itself. As we passed one of the larger chambers, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, movement in the shadows. I snapped my head towards it, but there was nothing there, only darkness, creeping along the edges of the room. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. "Keep moving," I said, though my voice felt hollow even to me. I had no idea why I was trying to convince myself. Something was wrong, something that couldn't be ignored. The deeper we went, the more tangible the darkness became. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, suffocating the very air I tried to breathe. I could almost hear it, feel it, more than hear it. Watching us, following us. My skin prickled and every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I had no words to explain it to the others. There was no reason we couldn't leave, no logical explanation for the crushing sense of doom that had settled over us. But I could feel it in my bones. If we left now, we wouldn't survive, not in the way we thought we would. David glanced back at me, his face pale and drawn. "This place doesn't make sense," he said, almost as if speaking to himself. It's like we're inside a dream. I can't make sense of the readings anymore." Suddenly I heard something louder than the hum, than the voices. The walls groaned and the floor beneath our feet trembled. A low rumbling sound filled the room, vibrating through my chest. We all stopped, frozen in place. Something was happening. Something was coming. Then, without warning, the floor cracked. A jagged tear split across the concrete, and out of it poured a thick, viscous black liquid, like oil, but darker, almost alive. It pooled on the floor, oozing toward us in slow, deliberate movements. My heart raced. "Move!" Kaplan shouted, but it was too late. The liquid spread faster than I could react, and in its wake the room seemed to warp. The walls bent and twisted as though they were made of paper, crumpling into unnatural shapes. I took a step back, and as I did, something reached up from the black mass. Long, claw-like appendages reached toward me, and I barely had time to raise my weapon before they were upon me. I fired blindly, the shots echoing through the room, but it did nothing. The creature, whatever it was, did not recoil. It only came closer. "Get out! Now!" Kaplan's voice was a scream now, panic rising in him as it had never done before. We ran, pushing past the writhing black tendrils as the building around us seemed to collapse, groan and shift. The walls twisted, the ceiling buckled, nothing made sense anymore. And that was when I realized we had crossed a threshold. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. We weren't just in an abandoned facility anymore. We were inside something alive, something ancient, and it had been waiting for us. We stumbled through the corridors, adrenaline surging through our veins. The black liquid continued to seep across the floor behind us, its movement far too deliberate, far too conscious. It had no business existing in this place, but it moved with purpose. Our footsteps echoed in the shifting halls, but the walls themselves seemed to stretch, the floor uneven beneath us. It was as if the facility itself was folding in on itself, rearranging, trapping us within its labyrinthine depths. I glanced back over my shoulder, the blackness just behind us, only to see it vanish for a split second, then return with an eerie speed. "Where the hell are we going?" Ilya shouted, his breath ragged as he ran beside me. "These corridors are changing." I didn't have an answer for him. The world around us felt like it was slipping away, distorting as we moved. One moment we were in a tight hallway. The next we were standing in a vast, empty space with walls that stretched impossibly far. I could feel the pulse of the building around us, its heartbeat, its rhythm, pushing us deeper into its maze. The walls hummed with a quiet, disturbing energy, vibrating in the air. Each time I tried to pinpoint the source of the sound, it seemed to shift, always just out of reach. David was the first to notice it, a faint flickering of the lights above us. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks, but then the lights cut out entirely, plunging us into darkness. We froze. The hum of the building was louder now, vibrating through the air, and I could feel it in my bones like a low, insistent pressure that refused to let up. "Stay calm," Kaplan ordered, though his voice was strained. "Check your gear." I felt the weight of my rifle in my hands, the cold metal comforting, but I knew it would do us little good here. My flashlight cut through the blackness, and for a moment, everything seemed normal, just a dark, decaying corridor. But then the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, twisting and writhing. I blinked, and when I looked again, the shadows had shifted, no longer still but moving, like something was crawling inside them. The air was thick, heavier than before, like a pressure pressing down from above. I could taste the metal in the air again, stronger this time, as if the walls were closing in on us. I took another step forward, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of my heartbeat but unmistakable. It was calling my name. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to David, my voice tight. His eyes met mine, wide and uncertain. He nodded, his mouth opening to say something, but before he could speak, the whispering grew louder, closer. "Shit, that's not," David began, but his words were cut off by the sudden scream of Ilya. He had turned to face the hallway behind us, his eyes wide with terror. The shadows had shifted, and in the darkness, something had moved. The lights flickered again, and for an instant I saw it. A pale, humanoid figure, tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow. It stood perfectly still, its arms reaching out toward us. And then, it was gone. vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Go, go, go!" Kaplan shouted, his calm demeanor now completely shattered. "Move!" We ran, not knowing where we were going or why, just driven by the instinct to escape the pressure that was closing in around us. But the facility was playing tricks on us. The walls seemed to twist as we ran, the doors opening into the same rooms we had just passed, like we were stuck in some kind of maddening loop. There was no escape, no way out. The whispers grew louder. They were no longer just faint murmurs in the distance. They were all around us, calling our names, echoing through the halls like a chorus of voices, unintelligible but insistent. I could feel the presence of something behind us, following us, always just out of sight but never far enough away. Every turn we made only seemed to bring us deeper into the labyrinth. The building was alive, breathing, moving with us. David stopped suddenly, his eyes wide with horror. He was staring at the walls, his face pale. "The symbols, they're changing," he said, his voice shaking. I turned to look, my flashlight casting long beams across the walls. The strange symbols we had seen earlier, the ones I had dismissed as part of the building's decay, were no longer still. They had started to glow, faintly at first, but then brighter, pulsating with an otherworldly light. It was like the building itself was reacting to our presence, alive with some kind of energy, some kind of force that we could not comprehend. The symbols seemed to shift, their shapes twisting and changing before our eyes, forming patterns that I could not make sense of. And then, the whispers grew into something more, something tangible. It was no longer just a sound in the air. It was in my head, inside my skull, like the very thoughts I was having were being twisted and distorted. I could hear voices, hundreds of them, calling to me, each one speaking a different language, each one calling my name. They were getting louder, closer. "Please just get us out of here," I said, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice. "We need to leave." But I knew it was too late. Whatever was in this place, whatever was controlling it, had already marked us. We were no longer in control. The walls seemed to bend and shift, pulling us in all directions at once. The floor beneath us groaned, cracking, as though it was breaking apart. And then, the whispers stopped. The silence was absolute. We were still moving, but the air had changed. It felt wrong. I could hear my own breath, shallow and fast, the pounding of my heart in my ears. The walls around us no longer felt like walls. They felt like a cage, a trap, closing in on us. And that's when I saw it, the figure again. Only this time it wasn't just in the shadows. It was standing in the middle of the corridor, its form distorted, its face an unreadable blur. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, two black pits that seemed to stare directly into my soul. "Don't look away," I heard a voice whisper in my ear, and I froze, my body going rigid. I could feel it, its presence pressing on me, suffocating me. The others had seen it too. Ilya's hands were shaking as he raised his weapon, but there was no point. The creature, or whatever it was, didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't waiting for us to leave. It wasn't even waiting to kill us. It was simply waiting. And it could wait forever. We stood frozen in the hallway, our breaths ragged, eyes locked on the figure that had materialized before us. It didn't move. It didn't blink. Its presence was palpable, like a suffocating force pressing down on us from all sides. The air itself had grown heavy, thick with the oppressive weight of something ancient and unfathomable. I could feel the temperature plummet, my skin breaking out in goosebumps as the shadows around it seemed to deepen, spreading like tendrils reaching toward us. "Move!" Kaplan barked, his voice cutting through the stifling silence, but his command had no effect on us. We were paralyzed, each of us locked in a silent battle with our own fear. The creature, or whatever it was, remained motionless, its dark, soulless eyes piercing into ours, seemingly aware of our every movement, every thought. I wanted to look away, to flee, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my mind racing with 1,000 questions I couldn't answer. It was David who broke the spell. With a trembling hand, he reached for his radio, his voice trembling as he tried to make contact with headquarters. But there was nothing, No signal, no response, only static. The oppressive silence seemed to swallow the transmission, and the hopeless realization hit us all at once. We were cut off, completely alone. I glanced back at the walls. The symbols that had once been faint and distant were now glowing bright, their pulsating light seeping into every crack, every corner. They were no longer just etched into the stone. They were part of the building, part of the very fabric of reality itself. The walls seemed to undulate, shifting as though they were alive, their surfaces warping with each passing second. The air was thick with a strange energy that vibrated through my chest, like the very foundation of the building was humming in a frequency I couldn't comprehend. "Stay together," Kaplan whispered, his voice hoarse, but the order carried no real weight anymore. It was an instinctual command, one that came from years of training, but even he knew it was too late. We were no longer in control. The building itself seemed to have a life of its own, manipulating the space around us, distorting reality. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It didn't walk. It didn't shift. It simply appeared in front of us, as though it had blinked into existence in the blink of an eye. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, but before I could react, the creature's presence pressed down on me like a physical weight. The air was suffocating, thick and cold. I couldn't breathe. A sound echoed from somewhere in the distance. It was a low, guttural growl, primal and deep, reverberating through the walls of the facility. The growl was followed by something else. A hiss, a whisper of something inhuman, speaking words I couldn't understand. It was a language older than anything I knew, ancient, alien, and terrifying. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat, frozen by the overwhelming sense of dread that filled every inch of the room. The creature's form flickered again, and then for the first time it spoke. Its voice was not a voice at all. It was a thought, a cold, intrusive presence in my mind, as if it were speaking directly into the fabric of my consciousness. "You are not meant to be here." The words reverberated through my skull, and I felt a sharp pain behind my eyes, like my brain was being pulled in every direction at once. I staggered back, clutching my head, but the voice, its voice, continued to echo, drowning out everything else. It wasn't just speaking to me. It was speaking to all of us. "You have awakened us." Ilya moved suddenly, his hands shaking as he pulled out a grenade, his face pale and sweat-streaked. "We need to get out," he muttered, his voice breaking. But the grenade, like everything else, was useless here. No amount of firepower could stop what we were facing. Before anyone could respond, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, bending around us like liquid, enveloping us. I felt the coldness bite into my skin, as though the shadows were no longer just shadows. They were alive. Each movement of the creature sent ripples through the air, warping the light around us, creating fleeting moments of clarity followed by overwhelming darkness. For every step we took, it felt like we were sinking deeper into a nightmare. "Get out of here," Ilya whispered, his eyes wide with panic. But no one moved. We couldn't. It was as if the building itself was holding us captive, manipulating the very space we moved through. Time had become irrelevant. What felt like minutes stretched into hours, and yet when I glanced at the others, I realized we had not moved from the same spot. I felt a sudden compulsion to look at the floor, and I saw them. Footprints. Dark, wet prints on the concrete floor. They weren't ours. They were too large, too distorted, their shapes melting and shifting before my eyes, as if they were being left behind by something far larger, far older than any human could comprehend. I looked up and noticed that the walls, once solid, were now covered in the same liquid black substance that had spread through the hallways, seeping from the cracks like a living thing. The footprints moved toward us, but with each flicker of the lights, they disappeared. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The shadows returned to their static, dormant state, and the coldness lifted slightly. But the damage was done. It had shown us something. It had made us aware of its presence, and in doing so, it had changed us. We were no longer just explorers of a forgotten facility. We were its guests, and it would never let us leave. As the air grew still once more, I realized that we were no longer alone. The whispers had returned, louder than before. They echoed from every corner of the room, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was as if the entire building had come alive, speaking in tongues that made my skin crawl. The presence of the creature, its mind, lingered in the air, its voice now a constant hum in the back of my skull. It wasn't just watching us anymore. It was inside us. I had never experienced anything like it. We had faced dangerous missions before, but nothing had prepared us for the presence that had just revealed itself to us. It wasn't just the sheer scale of what we were up against. It was the overwhelming realization that we were dealing with something far beyond human understanding. Something ancient, alien, and unfathomably powerful. The shadows stretched and pulsed, warping the room like liquid as we huddled together, our backs pressed against the crumbling walls. I could feel the cold seep through my uniform, biting into my skin. But it was not just the temperature. It was something deeper, a cold that permeated the very fabric of our reality. It gnawed at the edges of my mind, pulling at the threads of my sanity. The whispers continued, their distorted voices now a cacophony that seemed to echo from every direction, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But the one thing I knew, intuitively, without a doubt, was that these voices were not trying to communicate with us. They were simply observing, watching. The floor creaked beneath us, the walls groaning, and the building itself seemed to contract and expand with a life of its own. It was breathing, alive. Then with a sudden sharp sound, the air shifted. The oppressive weight that had been pushing down on us seemed to vanish, only to be replaced by a piercing stillness that filled the room. It was a silence so absolute that it felt like the world had come to a halt, like time itself had stopped. I couldn't hear my own breath. I couldn't hear anyone else. The oppressive hum of the facility had ceased, and in that eerie silence, I felt the presence of the entity, not in the shadows, not in the whispers, but directly in front of me. I forced my eyes to focus, though the flickering lights made it difficult to see anything clearly. And then I saw it. The figure from before, the one that had flickered in and out of existence, was standing before us, fully corporeal now. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body unnaturally long and thin. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers too long, too spindly, like an insect's. Its face was obscured in shadow, its features indistinguishable. But there was something about it. A presence, a weight. It was as though it existed beyond the physical realm, more like a shadow of something ancient, something that had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. It did not move. It did not speak. It simply watched. But I could feel it. I could feel its eyes, if they could be called eyes, on me. My mind screamed to look away, to run, to do anything to escape the overwhelming, suffocating gaze that bore into me. But I couldn't. It was as if my body had betrayed me, like I was caught in some kind of force beyond my control. "We're not alone," Ilya whispered, his voice thin and tremulous, but the words felt like an echo of something already known. There was no need to speak. We all knew what it meant. We had crossed a line we should never have crossed, and now we were caught in its web. The creature moved, but it didn't move in the way any living thing should. It didn't walk or shift. It simply appeared to glide toward us, its presence expanding in the air like a consuming fog. The floor beneath us trembled, and I could feel the ground vibrating with the resonance of its form, like the earth itself was shuddering in its wake. The shadows of the room seemed to stretch and warp, swirling around it as though they were alive, bending and twisting in strange, fluid motions. It was not human, not even close. And it wasn't some form of biological life we could comprehend. It was something older, something that had existed long before mankind had even emerged from the primordial depths of Earth. It was not merely a creature. It was a force. A presence that transcended everything we knew. "We need to leave. Now," Kaplan said. But his voice was strained, desperate. He reached for his weapon, his hands shaking, but it was a futile gesture. I could feel it. Whatever this thing was, whatever it represented, no force we had could stop it. I turned to David, but he was staring at the creature with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth moving as if trying to speak, but no words came out. His hands trembled at his sides, and I saw his finger twitch toward the radio, but he didn't speak into it. The radio had been useless from the start. The creature was the signal. It had been the hum in the walls, the distortion in our communications. It was the very thing that had been controlling the flow of information within this place. And then, in the dead silence, the creature spoke. Not with a voice, but with a thought. A piercing, invasive presence in my mind. It wasn't just speaking to one of us. It was speaking to all of us, to the deepest corners of our consciousness. You are not meant to know. The words weren't words at all. They didn't come through our ears. They didn't vibrate the air. They were felt, like a cold weight pressing into the center of my chest, suffocating me from the inside out. And the second the words touched my mind, I felt a jolt, a shockwave, rip through my consciousness. It was as if my very thoughts were being pulled apart, shredded like paper, scattered in every direction. David screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was a guttural, animalistic sound, a primal cry of terror and pain. His body spasmed as though something was tearing through him from the inside. His eyes went wide with panic as he staggered backward, hands clutching at his head. But it was no use. Whatever force this thing commanded, it was changing him. The creature moved again, faster now, its body flickering in and out of focus, as though its form wasn't completely bound to the physical world. It was too real and not real at the same time, like it existed in multiple planes of reality at once. I could see its limbs stretching out, distorting, elongating, far beyond the limitations of biology. David's screams grew louder as he collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain. His body began to shift, his limbs twisting in ways they should not have, his skin taking on a translucent, sickly hue. His face, his features, began to collapse, distorting as though his very existence was being torn apart at the seams. It was as though the creature had reached inside him and was remaking him. "We have to get out," I shouted, but it was too late. The entity had already claimed its first victim, and we were next. I could feel the air shift again. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us only intensified. There was no escape from the sense of being surrounded by something vast, something ancient. The room, no, the entire facility, seemed to pulse with an alien energy. It vibrated, almost alive, as if it had become one with the very essence of the being that stood before us. We were not just intruders, we were pawns in something far grander than any of us had anticipated. David's screams still echoed in my mind, but they were fading. His form, contorted and twisted beyond recognition, was now a grotesque mockery of the man he had once been. I could see his limbs elongating unnaturally, skin shifting from human to something other, something unrecognizable. His face had collapsed in on itself like clay being melted under a terrible heat. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horror that was unfolding before me. He was becoming something else, something not human. Kaplan, ever the professional, stood motionless for a heartbeat longer, but I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he reloaded his rifle. There was no room for hesitation now. This was no longer about a mission. This was survival. "We need to move now," he shouted, his voice carrying an urgency I had never heard from him before. But it was already too late. The ground beneath our feet trembled violently. The walls, which had already been warping and shifting, now seemed to stretch in every direction, bending impossibly, as though the very structure of the facility was being rewritten. The lights flickered again, this time with a maddening intensity, casting grotesque shadows that danced around us like living things. The shadows, those same unnatural shapes, seemed to move with purpose, reaching out toward us, drawn by our very presence. Ilya, who had been closest to David, reached for him, but the moment his hand touched David's mutated form, he recoiled with a scream of his own. His fingers, already pale and trembling, began to twist and distort, and I watched in horror as his arms seemed to shrink, the flesh turning translucent. It looked as though his body was being drained of something vital, life itself perhaps. The veins on his arm bulged grotesquely, stretching unnaturally as though they were about to snap. God, what the hell's happening to us? Ilya gasped, his voice a breathless whisper, his wide eyes darting around the room. Before anyone could respond, the shadows seemed to come alive. They rippled around Ilya's feet, and without warning, the ground beneath him gave way. I could see the floor cracking, splintering as though something from beneath was pulling at him. And then, with one horrific scream, Ilya was gone, swallowed by the darkness, his body sucked into the very walls themselves. "No!" Kaplan roared, stepping forward, but there was nothing to reach, nothing to pull. The darkness had consumed Ilya, just as it had begun to swallow David. There was no resistance, there was no hope of saving him, and I knew in that instant we were next. The air was thick with tension, with an energy that felt both ancient and alien, stretching across the fabric of our reality. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were voices, no longer calling us from the shadows, but speaking directly into our minds. They were not just speaking to us, they were controlling us. I could feel their thoughts press into mine, too heavy to ignore. "You are nothing. You are prey. You are fuel." The words were not spoken in any human tongue. They were felt, a ripple of alien thought that was colder than anything I had ever experienced. My chest tightened, and I felt the crushing weight of dread pressing into my lungs. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The overwhelming sense of helplessness was unbearable. David's body, now barely human, began to stand on its own. The grotesque transformation had rendered him unrecognizable, but his eyes, they were still his. He looked at us, but there was nothing left in those eyes. His humanity had been stripped away. He was a vessel. He was not the person he had been. Kaplan raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking. He fired once, twice, but the bullets didn't seem to have any effect. The creature, David's body, didn't even flinch. It just stood there staring at us, its unblinking eyes now wide with a malevolent, cold understanding. It wasn't moving. It wasn't attacking. It was waiting. A deep rumble vibrated through the facility, and the walls began to twist, bending at impossible angles. The facility wasn't just an old building anymore. It was alive. It had woken up. I could feel it. I could feel the space around me twisting, warping, crumbling into something else. The lines between dimensions were no longer clearly defined. Time itself began to lose meaning. Seconds stretched into minutes, and minutes stretched into hours. The shadows, the things that were watching us from the corners of our vision, began to take shape. They were no longer just black voids. They were figures. They were entities. I staggered back, unable to keep my bearings as the floor beneath me seemed to shift. I felt dizzy, like the world itself was spinning around me. The air had become thick, suffocating, as though I were breathing in pure metallic weight. I turned to look at Kaplan, and I could see it in his eyes, the same realization that was creeping into mine. We weren't just stuck in a building anymore. We were stuck in something else. We had crossed into a place where the laws of reality did not apply. The whispers began again, louder this time. They surrounded us, pressing in from every direction. The very walls of the facility seemed to pulse with energy, and as the shadows deepened, I realized with horror that they weren't just in the walls. The walls themselves were alive, breathing, moving. David, Ilya, both gone. There was no saving them. And now, it was just Kaplan and I. The others had been taken, altered beyond recognition, and we would be next. The walls seemed to bend inward, closing us off from any hope of escape. The air was thick with an overwhelming presence, a force so suffocating that it felt as though the very atmosphere was conspiring to crush us. Every breath I took tasted metallic, bitter, like something alive was trying to claw its way down my throat. The temperature had dropped further, the chill gnawing at my skin. But it was more than just physical cold. It was as though the entire building had been frozen, caught in the grip of something ancient, something inescapable. We had no time. The creature, David's form, now little more than a distorted, writhing mass, was moving toward us. It didn't walk. It floated. Each movement was deliberate, calculated. The shadows that followed it moved in sync with its form, stretching and folding like dark liquid tendrils. The eyes, the cold, alien eyes that still shone with some faint trace of humanity, locked onto me. And in that moment, I felt my mind fracture. My body was still, but my thoughts were spiraling, pulled into a vortex of images, sensations, and voices that weren't mine. I saw glimpses of ancient civilizations, cities lost to time, burning, falling into darkness. I saw galaxies collapsing, stars dying in the cold void. It was as though the creature was showing me everything it had witnessed, everything it had known over countless millennia. You should have stayed away, the thought echoed in my mind, not in words, but in an overwhelming sensation, a wave of knowing, ancient and full of contempt. I felt my knees buckle under the weight of it. The reality of it all began to settle in. We were not just being hunted, we were being consumed. "Kaplan," I gasped, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature. "We can't fight this. We need to leave. But the words died in my throat as the walls around us continued to bend and pulse, the shadows growing longer and more aggressive, stretching into unnatural shapes that no longer resembled anything remotely human. The sound of the building itself, groaning, crackling, was a constant background noise now. It was as if the very foundation of reality was shuddering, collapsing under the weight of whatever force had been awakened within this cursed place. Kaplan stood beside me, his rifle raised, though it seemed like a futile gesture. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but there was still something in his posture that screamed of defiance. I admired his resolve, but even he couldn't deny what we were facing. We were no longer soldiers in a war. We were prey, simple, powerless, and at the mercy of something that had seen the birth of stars and the end of worlds. And then it happened. The creature, David's twisted, writhing form, came closer. I could hear its ragged breathing, if it could be called breathing. The air around it shimmered as though reality itself was buckling under the pressure of its presence. It reached out with one elongated, spindly hand, its fingers curling unnaturally long like claws, and touched Kaplan's arm. I watched, horrified, as the flesh where it made contact began to peel away, disintegrating as if burned by some unseen flame. Kaplan grunted in pain, trying to pull away, but his body was frozen. His eyes met mine, wide with disbelief, but there was no time to process. It was happening too fast. The creature's gaze turned to me then, its alien eyes locking onto mine. I could feel it, its presence filling me, pulling at my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a vine, tightening and constricting. I felt it in every fiber of my being. It wasn't just observing me, it was inside me, and in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. The creature didn't need to kill us. It didn't need to tear us apart physically. It was remaking us. It was turning us into something else. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, I felt the words, thoughts, memories, rushing through my mind, not in any language, but in pure sensation. A flood of alien knowledge, experiences, emotions, none of it mine. It was as though my very identity was being overwritten, replaced by something older, something far beyond anything I could understand. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Kaplan collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his body twitching violently as the last of his strength drained from him. I could see his face now, etched with confusion and horror, his eyes glazed. He looked at me, but I knew he was no longer Kaplan. Whatever had happened to him, whatever the creature had done, had stripped him of his humanity. He was gone. The creature, David, or what had once been David, stepped back, the shadows around it swirling like smoke. It tilted its head, as if contemplating its next move, and then, to my absolute horror, the figure spoke. Not in words, not through sound, but directly into my mind. "You are a part of this now." The message was cold, final, and suffocating. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. We had crossed into its domain, and now we were bound to it. I turned, my mind barely holding on to reality as I scrambled toward the exit, my legs shaking, my chest tight. But the hallway was gone. The door was gone. The entire facility had shifted again, leaving no clear path out. The walls warped around me, closing in from all sides. The darkness reached out like tendrils, clawing at the air, pulling at me, dragging me deeper into the maze of horrors that had been unleashed. I was trapped. We were all trapped. The entity had claimed us, and there was no escape. The oppressive air inside the facility grew thicker with each passing moment. The walls, once crumbling and static, had now become a living, breathing organism, expanding and contracting as though it was taking on a life of its own. I could feel the pressure in my chest, the weight of it almost too much to bear. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, curling around corners, whispering in languages that no human ear should comprehend. Time, as I knew it, had fractured. Seconds dragged into hours, and hours felt like minutes. The building was no longer a place, it was a prison. It was a tomb. Kaplan lay motionless on the ground, his face blank and unrecognizable, but his body still twitched sporadically, an involuntary spasm of what little remained of his humanity. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't alive either. Whatever had happened to him, whatever that entity had done to him, had stripped him of everything. His soul, his mind. He was hollow, and he was not the only one. I turned away from him, the weight of reality settling over me like a heavy blanket. The floor beneath me seemed to undulate, warping with every step, and the walls continued their slow collapse, closing in like the jaws of some ancient beast. There was no escape, not through the corridors we had once navigated. Everything was shifting, transforming into something beyond comprehension. But I refused to believe we were completely trapped. I had to try. We had to try. The creature's presence was suffocating, its malevolent energy filling every inch of the facility. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could feel it, watching, waiting, its influence ever present, its shadow looming over us like a living force. The walls seemed to respond to it, bending and twisting, as if the facility was nothing more than an extension of the entity itself. We had awakened it, and now we were its prisoners. I stumbled through the crumbling hallways, the air growing colder with each step, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The flickering lights overhead cast distorted shadows that twisted and shifted in impossible ways. They seemed to mock me, pushing me further into the madness. And then, just when I thought I might lose myself to the disorientation, I saw it. The exit. The door that had once seemed so far away, now just a few meters ahead. Without thinking, I moved toward it. My heart pounded in my chest and every fiber of my being screamed for escape. But as I reached for the door, I heard it. A low, guttural sound like the growl of some ancient beast reverberated through the walls. The door didn't open. It was as though the very fabric of reality had conspired to keep us in. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no!" I yanked at the door again, but it remained locked, its metal frame cold and unyielding. The growl grew louder, and the shadows around me seemed to stretch out, forming shapes, shifting into monstrous forms that weren't human. The room was closing in on me. I could feel the walls pushing inward, pressing against my body, constricting my every movement. The air was suffocating, too thick to breathe, and I knew that this was it. The final moment. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, my eyes darting around for any sign of hope. The walls had already begun to collapse in on themselves, and I was no longer certain what was real and what was just a product of my fraying sanity. Everything felt like a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. And then, in the corner of my vision, I saw something. Someone. It was Ilya, or what had once been Ilya. His face, once full of bravado, now twisted into something unrecognizable. His skin was stretched and translucent, his limbs elongated, and his eyes had turned pitch black like pools of liquid darkness. He stared at me, but there was no recognition in his gaze. It wasn't Ilya anymore. It was something else. Something that had replaced him. I barely had time to react before the walls shifted again. The exit I had been reaching for vanished, swallowed by the dark, twisting corridors. The facility was alive, shifting, changing, adapting to keep us within its grasp. The space around me felt warped, unreal, as though reality itself had been turned inside out. The air hummed with a low frequency, vibrating against my bones. I turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The very building had become my enemy. Every hallway, every door, every escape route had disappeared. The creature, it, was closing in on us. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the shadows, inside my head. There was no way out. But then, the walls shifted once more, and this time, there was something else in the room with me. A figure. I don't know how it had gotten there, but it stood at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a thing that could be described in human terms. It was a shifting mass of shadows, a grotesque amalgamation of limbs, eyes, and shapes that defied logic. Its form flickered in and out of existence, like a broken projection that couldn't quite hold itself together. And then it spoke, but not in words. It was a thought, a presence, a feeling that flooded my mind with an overwhelming certainty. You are ours. The shadows closed in, and I realized with a sickening clarity that I was no longer in control of my body. My arms grew heavy, my legs unsteady. I was falling into a void. There was no escape. The last thing I remember was the cold, a biting, penetrating cold that gnawed at my flesh. And then, nothing. I woke up to the sound of distant, indistinct whispers, too faint to make out but undeniably present. It took me a moment to realize I was no longer in the facility, no longer trapped in the labyrinth of shifting walls and ever-encroaching shadows. But as I became aware of my surroundings, an unsettling realization dawned on me. I wasn't the same. The world around me was wrong. The sky above me stretched out in unnatural hues, too bright, too sharp. The colors seemed off, as though they were refracted through a prism that distorted reality itself. The air tasted strange, metallic, like blood in my mouth. And the ground beneath me felt soft, almost spongy, as though I was walking on something alive. I glanced down at my hands, trembling, and immediately noticed something was wrong. My skin, once darkened from years in the field, had paled to an unnatural white. My fingers were thin, almost translucent, as though I were fading into the environment around me. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. I looked up and saw Kaplan standing a few feet away, but he wasn't the man I had known. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, as though the spark of life had been extinguished. His movements were stiff, jerky, and unnatural, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tightly. He turned his head toward me with a slow, deliberate motion, his face blank, expressionless. "Kaplan?" I asked, my voice cracking. But he didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge me. He just stood there, unmoving. And that's when I saw it. The black, pulsating veins running beneath his skin, spreading like ink through water. They twisted across his face and down his arms, like a living parasite eating away at him from the inside. His flesh had become translucent, the veins throbbing beneath the surface. He wasn't just altered. He was being consumed. I turned my attention back to the surroundings. We weren't in the facility anymore. We were outside, though the landscape had no real form, no identifiable features. The horizon stretched infinitely in all directions, a barren wasteland of twisted earth and alien shapes that shifted at the corner of my eye. The sun, or what I assumed was the sun, hung too low in the sky, casting an eerie, otherworldly light across the land. There were no trees, no structures, nothing that could give me a sense of scale or direction. I wasn't alone. Ilya was there too, though he had changed. His body, once compact and strong, now looked elongated and thin, his movements jerky and disjointed. His eyes were wide, unblinking, pools of black. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anything. His eyes were fixed on something distant, something far beyond this plane of existence. His mouth was open, but there was no sound. I couldn't tell if he was breathing. He was there, but not there. I wanted to scream, to run, to find a way out. But there was no escape. There was no exit. no safe haven. We were in a place that defied the laws of nature, a reality where everything had been twisted, distorted beyond recognition. And worse still, we had become part of it. We were no longer human, not fully, not in the way we had once been. My body trembled, but it wasn't just fear that gripped me. It was something else. I could feel it crawling under my skin, weaving its way into my bones, altering my very DNA. I wasn't just witnessing this transformation. I was experiencing it. I could sense the change taking place inside me, my thoughts becoming less coherent, my memories fragmented. The process was slow, but inexorable, and there was no escape. I turned to Kaplan, trying to reach him. His eyes were vacant, but there was a faint glimmer of recognition in them, a brief flash of who he had once been. But it was fleeting. Before I could speak, his head snapped to the side, and his gaze settled on something I couldn't see, something that wasn't there but was very much present. A deep, primal fear gripped me as I followed his stare. A shape moved in the distance. It was difficult to make out at first, just a shadow against the distorted landscape. But as it drew closer, I could see it clearly. It was not human. It was something else entirely, something far larger, far more ancient than anything we had ever encountered. Its form was both solid and fluid, shifting as it moved, like it was constructed of shadows, light, and something that felt like pure energy. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural hue, fixed on us, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It was not a creature. It was a presence, a force, alive, aware, and ancient beyond comprehension. We had woken it up. I could feel its influence creeping into my mind, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, unraveling the fabric of my reality. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. The shadow creature, whatever it was not hostile. It didn't need to be. It had been patient, waiting for us to destroy ourselves. It was content to watch us fall apart, to watch us fade into nothingness, and that was all we were now. We weren't survivors. We were expendable. I reached for my radio, but it was gone. The very idea of communication felt hollow, pointless. We were beyond the reach of any rescue. We were beyond help. And then the whispers came again, closer this time, pressing into my mind, filling the spaces between my thoughts. You are part of the new reality now. You are part of the whole. It was the voice of the entity, the thing that had claimed us, the thing that had transformed us into something other, something new. I could feel its power filling the air, coursing through my veins. The others, Kaplan, Ilya, were already lost. But I was aware of what was happening. I could feel myself slipping, losing my sense of self, becoming part of whatever it was that had taken control of us. And as I looked around, I realized with a sickening clarity that I had become a part of this place. I was no longer human. Not truly. We were the remnants of a broken world, lost in a space beyond time. The entity had no need to destroy us. It only needed us to fade. And we would. In time, we all would. It happened in a blink, and before I could even process it, I found myself back in the sterile confines of a military facility. The walls were white, clinical, too clean for the hell I had just endured. I was seated in a room alone, surrounded by quiet hums of equipment. My mind was still heavy with the presence of the entity, its whispers pressing against the edges of my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that lingered in my mind. The air felt wrong, too crisp, too clean. The weight of reality felt lighter here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The shadows no longer had the same depth. There was nothing around me that had the same weight. I wasn't sure what I expected, but this wasn't it. A man entered the room, a nondescript officer in a dark suit. He had no name, no rank I could discern. He simply sat across from me, his gaze fixed, his expression neutral. His eyes didn't give away anything. He was too calm. "Agent," he said, his voice cold and formal, yet carrying an unsettling weight. "You've been through a difficult operation. We understand that. He paused, as if waiting for me to respond, but I had nothing to say. What could I say? How do you explain what we had witnessed? How do you describe a force that bends reality itself? You will be debriefed, the officer continued, his words clipped and precise. But first we need you to recount your experience. All of it, from the beginning. No details left out. I stared at him, my mouth dry, my hands trembling. I had tried to block it out. The images, the sounds, the feeling of something other, something cosmic taking hold of us. I wanted to tell him everything, to scream the truth, but I couldn't. The words refused to form. The more I tried to remember, the more I felt like something was slipping through my fingers, like a dream fading with the morning light. There was an anomaly, I said, my voice hoarse. A facility in Ukraine. We went in to investigate, but there was something there. Something alive. My throat constricted, the words getting stuck. The officer's eyes didn't waver, and his silence pushed me to continue. I saw something in the dark, something that shouldn't have been real. It wasn't just a creature, it was a presence, an entity. It took us, all of us, one by one. I swallowed hard, and the walls, they shifted. The whole place, it was alive. The officer didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of emotion. He simply nodded and motioned for me to continue. The calmness in his demeanor made it harder for me to form coherent thoughts. My mind was splintered, each memory slipping between my fingers like sand. You were successful in extracting the relevant data, yes? His voice remained steady, but I could hear something beneath it. Something colder. His words were calculated, like they were trying to guide me, shape my recollections into something acceptable. I nodded numbly, though the truth of it was that there was no data to collect. There were no files to submit, no notes to process. There was only a hole, a yawning black abyss where the mission had once been. The walls of that place had rewritten everything. And now I wasn't sure what was real anymore, what was left of me. You were altered, correct? The officer asked, his gaze piercing, cold. I froze. The question hung in the air like a weight. There was no point in denying it. There was nothing left to deny. Kaplan, Ilya, David. They had all been altered in ways that no human mind could comprehend. And now it seemed, I was too. My skin had paled, my movements sluggish. The whispers that once haunted me were no longer distant. They were a constant undercurrent of thought, a dull thrum in the back of my skull. And every time I looked into a mirror, I felt less like myself, more like something else. I don't know, I stammered. I don't know what I've become. What we've become. The officer nodded again, this time more deliberately, his eyes hardening with a certain understanding that sent a chill down my spine. Of course, he said, his voice colder now, stripped of any pretense of compassion. You've been compromised. He stood up, motioning for me to follow him. Come with me. The process is simple. You will undergo reprogramming. The memories of this mission will be altered, removed, and you will be assigned to a new role, a new identity. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unyielding. But there was nothing I could do. I had no choice. The weight of what I had witnessed, of what I had become, settled deeper into my chest. They couldn't just erase it. They couldn't just remove it. Not from my mind. Not from my soul. As I stood up, I glanced around the sterile, featureless room once more. Everything was too clean, too perfect. A place designed to erase the past, to bury the truth beneath layers of bureaucracy and indifference. The walls felt like they were closing in on me again, and the whispers grew louder in my ears. But I was already being led down the hallway, toward the unknown, toward whatever new life they had planned for me, whatever role they had in store. And I knew, as I was ushered into another room, cold, metallic, and clinical, that the truth of what had happened in Ukraine would never be allowed to surface. The memories, the horrors, the entity, it would all be sealed, erased, and I would be forced to live in a new reality, one where the truth had been buried so deep that it might as well not exist at all. The last thought I had, as the door slammed shut behind me, was this: The entity had won. It had not needed to destroy us. It had only needed to wait. Wait for us to destroy ourselves. And it was waiting for us to finish. Waiting for humanity to fall apart, piece by piece. I do not remember how long I have been here in this sterile, cold apartment, or whatever this place is. Time has blurred. There are no clocks, no calendars. The days stretch into one another, indistinguishable. But what I do know is that the whispers are constant now, never quieting, always near. They are the only things that remain the same. I hear them when I wake, when I sleep, when I try to read or focus. They surround me, like the walls are breathing them into my mind. At first I told myself that I was imagining things, that the memories, the horror had somehow been scrubbed away with the reprogramming they had put me through. But they can't scrub this. They can't erase the feeling of the creature, the presence, the otherness that still clings to my thoughts. It's like a stain, a shadow that refuses to leave no matter how hard I try to push it away. No matter how many times I attempt to move forward, it's there, lurking in the dark corners of my mind. The apartment is too quiet, too perfect, too controlled. The lights flicker occasionally, not in the way they did in that place, but in a subtle, almost intentional way. It's as if they're reminding me of the moments of panic, the flickering of the walls, the changing of space that made the facility feel alive. The faint buzzing hum of the air conditioning, the monotonous tick of the refrigerator. All of it seems to pulse in time with my heartbeat, like the room itself is syncing with my very existence. I tried to make sense of it at first. I sought answers, papers, files, anything to explain the mission, what happened to Kaplan, Ilya, and David. But every time I even try to speak to anyone, the words dissolve into static, into lies. I have been told that nothing is wrong, that everything was taken care of, that the mission was a success. A success, they call it. As if the men I fought beside, the men I watched disappear, didn't matter. As if the building that twisted and bent around us was some minor technical issue to be wiped from the record. They told me that it was necessary to sever any ties to the past, that the information gathered was critical, and that the mission's true nature would never be declassified. I was assigned to a new role, one I don't remember accepting. No one told me what it entailed, only that it was important. But every task I perform, every duty they assign, feels hollow. It's like I'm not really doing anything. I'm just following orders that seem to come from somewhere deep within me, somewhere I can't quite place. The worst part is that I cannot remember what happened to the others. I can't remember how I left the facility. I know that I must have escaped somehow, but the details are fragmented, shattered in 1,000 different directions. I remember the dark figures that haunted the facility, but they are no longer clear. They are fading, like distant memories slipping into another lifetime. What remains, what I know for sure, is that there was something in the air, something in the walls, something ancient, that touched us all, something we were never meant to find. The worst part, though, the truly terrifying part, is the shadows. At night they move. At first I thought it was just the way the light played on the walls or a trick of my eyes, but no. They are alive. I've seen them, moving with purpose. They stretch across the floor, crawl along the corners, twisting into shapes that seem to mock the way humans move. There are limbs in the shadows, extra limbs that shouldn't be there. The shadows flicker with strange patterns, shapes that shouldn't exist, like alien symbols I can't quite understand. Sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I see them at the edge of my vision, creeping closer, their shapes warping as if they are reaching out for me. I can feel them, pressing on me. They are waiting. I know that. I know it with a deep, instinctual terror that I cannot explain. The whispers, too, have changed. They no longer speak in fragmented phrases. They call to me now. They call me by my name, over and over. And when I hear it, I feel a cold dread filling my chest, but I can't stop myself from listening. They whisper my name as if they already know me, as if they have known me for longer than I can remember. And their whispers, I now realize, do not come from my head. They come from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside the apartment, somewhere within the walls. I have tried to ignore it, to lock it out. But every time I look at the clock, it's wrong. The time doesn't match what I feel in my bones. The hands on the clock flicker, jump backward, then forward again. The shadows grow longer, even as the hours pass. The electronic devices in the apartment show countdowns, but I can't read them. They aren't in any language I know, though I can understand them. I feel it, deep inside me. They're telling me something. They're counting down to something I can't escape. The hallway outside my apartment is unnervingly silent, but sometimes I hear footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Too heavy to be human. They sound like they are coming closer, though when I step outside, no one is there. It's always the same. The footsteps echo down the hall, a deep, resonant sound that chills me to the bone. And the worst part? The part that I can't escape no matter how many times I try to sleep, to wake up to convince myself this is all just a nightmare, is that I feel it. I feel the presence of the entity, of the thing that had taken us. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's here, now. It's patient. It doesn't need to destroy us. It can wait for us to finish destroying ourselves.